Hey, everybody, and welcome to another midweek Bible study with me. I'm so glad that you're here today. We are taking a look at the book of the Bible known as Isaiah, which is a big deal. We are now beyond the what's called the wisdom literature in the Bible. That's Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and a couple weeks ago we did Song of Solomon. So all of those books kind of hold together as their own unique kind of genre of the Bible known as wisdom literature. It's very poetic. In concept, it's kind of a song, lyric, and so the meanings have a lot of double entendres to them a lot of the time. Now we are moving into some of the more prophetic books of the Bible, like Isaiah, who is a prophet, and we're going to see Isaiah, Jeremiah. These are all, like I said, prophets of the Bible, but they have a different genre to them. And so we got to learn a little bit about what biblical prophecy means as well. Isaiah is a huge book, 66 chapters long. We are not going to spend more time on it than necessarily some of the other books. But just, I want to let you know that there's going to be a lot of sub-themes that we're going to skip over today. So grab a Bible and check it out for yourself at some point. Isaiah, what it's about. If you're in a group setting, check it out. What do you know about it? Who was Isaiah maybe? Who was in it? When did it happen? As many facts as you can. You can hit pause and check that out now. For those of you watching live online, the theme, I don't want you to miss it, is that God's presence is supposed to at least shape our actions. Kind of want to do a summary here because it's an interesting book of the Bible where we have Isaiah, who lived in Jerusalem, and he spoke to both Israel and Judah. So this is a guy who was married, he had kids, he was highly educated, he had all this access to the royal family and the royal guard. There was no real doubts that, his parents had plans for him to live this comfortable future in high society. And these two words intervene every time, but God had other plans for Isaiah. He didn't live that comfortable life in high society. He lived as a prophet, and this is what that means. So Assyria, towards the end of the book, had already taken Israel into captivity. And so now Isaiah spends a lot of time addressing the southern kingdom of Israel. And Assyria was also threatening the southern kingdom, except for this divine intervention. You guys, in Isaiah 36 and 37, so Assyria takes over the north, and they're like knocking on the door of the south. And the king, Sennacherib, comes to Hezekiah as the king in the southern kingdom in the book of Isaiah. And Sennacherib says, listen, I'm coming for you too. It's just a matter of time. And Hezekiah very faithfully says, no, our God is going to protect us. And Sennacherib says, guys, you know how many nations I've taken over who all said that their king will protect us? And Hezekiah says, no, I think this one is going to be different. And Sennacherib says, I'm coming for you, pay up or else. And Hezekiah says, no, I don't think that's the case. And then these messages get exchanged back and forth. In Isaiah 36 and 37, this incredible thing happens where Sennacherib walks out of his tent one day and his army, 180,000 people, mysteriously died overnight. Now Hezekiah predicted this. Isaiah predicted this and said, this isn't going to be the case. In fact, there's going to be somebody else. That's going to be Babylon. That's going to take over Assyria. And Assyria, you are not going to take over the southern kingdom. And 180,000 troops later, Sennacherib goes back home, and in fact, his sons kill him in his capital city of Nineveh. But that's another story altogether. I just think it's kind of cool, history, that prophecy that we have recorded in the Bible purely as a historical account, historical text. It's pretty cool, and that lines up. Herodotus was a Greek historian, and he took a look at this, and he saw that event of the 180,000 who died, and he chalked it up to a certain kind of plague. It was like the bubonic plague that moved through the camp very, very quickly overnight. Followers of God, you might have another idea, but either way, it's undisputed that through this huge intervention, whether it was a plague caused by God, Jerusalem and the southern kingdom were absolutely spared. Anyway, you could just tell, this is all to say that when Isaiah does his work, listen, you guys, the southern kingdom is on edge. Like they know that they're holding on, but just barely. And so the book of Isaiah is 66 chapters long. Like I said, it's huge, but it has two main parts and with an intermission in between. The two parts in the intermission. First one is all about judgment. Israel's rebellion and mistreatment of poor. That's corruption, idolatry. This comes at a cost. That's the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah. Then there's the intermission, the exile, and then after that, hope. You guys, always hope. Every prophecy, it's so much doom and gloom, but listen, it always ends on hope. Every single book of the Bible. And as we get through the prophetic books, you're going to just see so much hope coming. So in Isaiah in particular, it says that God will fulfill his covenant promises. Like this is Messiah, this king, blessing is going to come. Just hang in there because it's going to get darker before it gets brighter. So the first 39 chapters of judgment, you can take a look at this. It starts off with this recognition of Isaiah of how holy, and I put it 3 times, holy, holy, holy. You know that song? Holy is God. And God's presence is here, and God's presence is supposed to change us, and God's presence is a huge theme throughout the book of Isaiah. Randy, thanks you for the shout out. Amen. I see that clapping in the comment section. And so Isaiah has this vision, this dream where he goes up before God. He sees the holiness of God, and God actually takes his coal out of the fire and burns Isaiah with it. And Isaiah is expecting, man, God's holiness. I'm expecting all to be just burned up and consumed alive. But what happens instead is God's holy presence, that coal, it doesn't burn him up. What it does is purify him, which is really surprising to Isaiah and say, I thought I was done for, but God has a purpose for me. And God says, keep announcing this judgment. But listen, the judgment that you're announcing, it's not going to have the effect that you want it to. People aren't going to turn toward me. In fact, their hearts are going to be hardened. But keep at it, because what's about to happen, they're going to have to know what you said about it and what you wrote about it in order to make sense of some of these future events. So keep at it. It'll make sense eventually. And we're going to find out, guys. It's going to make sense 100 years after Isaiah's own death. And it's going to make a lot more sense about 700-800 years after that, but I digress. So we've got these images of Israel being reduced to this smoldering stump, but there's this holy seed coming out, and you're like, I can't really make sense of that. Isaiah goes to Ahaz, the king, and says, hey, Assyria's coming, it's going to chop it down. That's exactly what happens. There's going to be this new king called Immanuel. That's God with us. Immanuel is coming. Immanuel is going to emerge from the stump. Immanuel will be this holy seed. His kingdom, Immanuel's kingdom, this new kind of king is going to come in a way that's going to, in fact, change all kings. And then also there's Babylon. There's going to take over Assyria. I'm kind of blowing through a lot of the book of Isaiah here. And then it ends with this tale of two cities. We've got the lofty city full of this rebellious humanity and destined for ruin. And then the new Jerusalem, humble to God, no more death, no more crying, no more mourning. Does that sound familiar? Does anybody remember where we saw that theme? The city of God, the new Jerusalem, where there's no crying, no death, where God will wipe every tear from every eye, this beautiful picture. Drop in the comments if you remember where that is, what book of the Bible, let's say, where that is. No Googling, by the way. All right, so then we've got Hezekiah who tries to make this alliance with Babylon. When has that ever worked out? So Hezekiah, let me change that, shows off his whole treasury and his temple, all of their successes to Babylon to try to impress them. Why do we do that? Right? Like Hezekiah, he knows that Babylon is bad. He knows that they're more destructive than Assyria ever was. But Hezekiah, the king, he's like, well, let me wow you with what I have. This isn't going to end. Isaiah basically just face palms at the end of this first part and says, this isn't going to make sense. And you can guess what happened. Exile happens. Babylon isn't impressed by what Israel has, the southern kingdom. They're not impressed. They're motivated to take them over. That's exactly what happened. So there's this interesting split. We've got the judgment in the first half of saying hey, judgment is going to come and the people don't buy it. Exile happens. That's the judgment. And then the second one, hope. But the tone in Isaiah shifts. Historically, in the Bible, it's a weird time because it shifts to this announcement of hope where the exile is over. And as it goes on, the exile is just kind of over. And this is some of the time when people who don't really read the Bible, I'll say maybe I do and maybe many of you do from a divinely inspired sense, from a historical way, start to say, well, this is why the Bible can't be trusted. There must be several different authors of Isaiah, and it doesn't really make sense. It skips all over the place. The reason for this is that the voice shifts dramatically. In fact, the first part of Isaiah takes place pre-exile, then there's the exile. Second part takes place after the whole exile is completely finished, and several years after that. Remember, it was a 70-year exile. The second half of Isaiah takes place 100 years after Isaiah himself died. How is that possible, right? What sense does that make? Okay, so we've got some options. The first option is that Isaiah was a prophet. His voice is transported 200 years into the future. I mean, God could do anything, right? I mean, he could move Isaiah 100 years past his death. I mean, that's possible. More likely, though, I would say, is that there's several references in that first part of Isaiah. Take Isaiah 8 verse 16. You can look that up later. Where Isaiah, he wrote up some of his writings. He sealed them, these scrolls and envelopes, and he gave them to his disciples and said, here, save these for a more appropriate time. And so what we're probably seeing, I would say, in that second half of Isaiah is the disciples opening up, and because he was a prophet and is divinely inspired, the writings of Isaiah from a couple hundred years ago were actually reliable and were actually true. And so Isaiah was writing them, but he wasn't saying them. I mean, he said them, but he sealed them up in the envelopes. And his disciples were delivering them as if he was giving them in that moment exactly. This is kind of a cool picture, but whatever the view that you have, it doesn't so much matter. The point is that it announces hope after exile. It announces that those promises of a messianic kingdom, of a kingdom that will never end, of a kingdom where God will wipe away the tears, of a kingdom where there's no mourning and no more death, that kingdom is coming. That reference was Revelation, by the way. Israel, though, doesn't quite get it. And Israel complains about God and complains that the exile caused them to lose their faith. And so there's this trial in the second half. This is weird. They put God on trial. There's accusations to God. You left us. Maybe you're not as big as Babylon's God. And essentially, God gives us a response and saying, you guys, the exile was judgment, not neglect. The exile was because of the corruption that you had. The exile was because you were straying away from me. It was my judgment. It was a discipline as a parent, not neglect of you. I never forgot what I was doing. And so the right conclusion of all of this is that Israel is the God of all of history. In fact, he called the Persians that would take over the Babylonians, who took over the Assyrians, like all of this stuff. God is in charge. God had orchestrated it all. We're going to do Daniel pretty soon in that book. Man, from global history kind of stuff, really, really impressive. Israel generally still doesn't really get it, though, and so God promises this new thing. This new thing is a big thing. The new thing that Isaiah talks about in the second part of Isaiah is a huge deal. Remember, the people don't get it. And so God says, you need someone to step in and do for you what you can't do yourself. And so they start talking about God's new thing is actually a servant who has this mission. The mission is going to be, number one, to restore Israel and God's people. Number two, to be a light to the nations. And this servant right here is going to be rejected, is going to be killed. He's going to die on behalf of, of their sins. And then he'll simply be alive again and declare that the people will be right with God. I mean, you get where this is going, right? Like who's he actually talking about? Well, I don't think Isaiah knows. I think he's just writing down what God told him to write down. I don't think it made any sense whatsoever to Isaiah, which is really pretty cool. We see that the servant there, right, has this awesome mission. He's going to die on behalf of the sins. He's going to be alive and declare that the people will be right with God. And they'll be servants. And then the people will have a response based on that presence of that servant. They'll be sort of self-sorting into servants of the servant, right? Servants of the servant. So they're called just servants. And then there's going to be the wicked who reject the servant, depending on the response. And then Isaiah ends with this picture of, again, this new Jerusalem, that city of God that belongs to the servants. So listen, this Bible study is a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. Where do you spot Jesus in Isaiah? It's not remarkably difficult on this one. Some books it is, like Song of Songs last time, a couple weeks ago, that was a little more difficult. It's not hard to spot Jesus in the book of Isaiah. We do it every Christmas. I mean, for crying out loud, most of the Christmas prophecies, behold, a child or a virgin will give birth to a child. They'll call him Immanuel. That's our whole series this past Christmas at Encounter. Christmas Comes Close was about the God who draws near. And you heard, if you attended, me quote Matthew chapter 1 every single week of that series. The virgin will conceive, give birth to a son. They will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. Jesus is the Immanuel. Jesus is the servant. Jesus is the new thing. Jesus is the one who will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Jesus will have the mission to restore Israel and all of Israel, those of us who put our faith and hope in him. Jesus will be the light to the nations. Jesus will be rejected and will be killed. He will die on behalf of our sins. He will be made alive again. We know that's the resurrection coming up that we're going to celebrate Good Friday and Christmas here at Encounter. Don't forget. And there'll be servants and there'll be wicked depending on our response. This new Jerusalem called heaven is a reality and it will belong to God's servants. I mean, guys, this Isaiah all points towards Jesus himself in such a cool way. It's a really, really neat book. There's a lot of chapters that we didn't get to, obviously, because it's a massive book as well. So take a look at it when you get a chance on your own. For now, we've got some reflection questions. I'm going to leave those up on the screen for a little while. What did you learn? What did you take away from this study of Isaiah? Who are the main characters? Who are the people? Who are the kings? Who are the nations? Tell the story, the narrative of Isaiah. It kind of has this arc to it. And then also about God's presence. The presence, the holiness of God that was laid out in the first few chapters, that's supposed to change our whole lives. The holiness of Jesus, the Immanuel with us, is supposed to change our lives. Is it? How is it? Awesome, guys. Well, thanks for joining in. Keep the comment section going below. I love to see that. And we'll see you next week as we take on more of the Bible Wednesday at noon. Take care.